Control is a game made by Remedy Entertainment, but I only know that because I googled it right now for this script. I honestly know exactly nothing about this game. All I do know is that it had some level of hype around it when it released, although it would seem to me it never really became a mainstream video game. Whether it did or not, I thought it looked interesting and decided to finally give it a shot. I did a blind run, I have some thoughts, so let's get into it. The most basic overview of the entire game is that you, the main character, whose name is... Wait, what's my name again? Jesse. Oh, good. I did remember it, right? So Jesse walks into the bureau where this thing called the Hiss has gotten loose. And now you go around with magic, nanobot, I don't even know what gun, shooting things until the problem is solved like a true American. Well, I guess you're not actually trying to solve the problem. You're only interested in saving your brother who was kidnapped by the bureau when you were both kids. That said, I could be totally wrong in my assessment of this game's story because it was quite confusing and hard to keep track of. If you've ever watched any of my videos, you know I don't really play games for the story, but I'm doing the YouTube thing and viewers actually expect me to engage with the story. What is this nonsense? So I watched all the cutscenes and tried to piece together what was going on, and despite my best efforts, I still haven't the foggiest, other than the most surface level interpretation of the game's events at least. I even went online after the fact and discovered there are several articles that attempt to explain the ending. Did I read them? No, this video isn't about the story anyways. It's just about my honest thoughts as I did a blind run of this game that I guess might have been popular. If I were to try and describe the story to someone, I'd say it's like a Christopher Nolan film. It's high concept, dramatic, tense, and you're never quite sure where everybody's loyalties lie or even what's going to happen next. At the same time, it's so high concept that most of what happens still makes little sense to me at all, and there's several story things the game doesn't hardly explain unless I miss some sort of info dump somewhere. I've heard some people say movies like Tenet, Interstellar, or Inception require you to watch the movie several times before you get it. And at that point, I ain't interested anymore. Give me something to work with here, game. With the story out of the way, let's get to the game's mechanics now. The game really starts, in my opinion, the first time you're thrown into the astral plane. It's here that you get your gun, which automatically makes it the best place in the entire game. Astral planes are an interesting lot, as it's a separate dimension, or I suppose plane of existence, from the real world. And if you ever find yourself here, it means you're going to be gaining some sort of new ability. The astral plane is also where you talk with the entity called the board, and it would seem to me the board functions like the Avatar cycle, where past directors of the Bureau are able to communicate with you or something to that effect. They don't really guide you per se, but they are there and they say things. I pretty much ignored them most of the time. They're just kind of flavoring. I don't know. You don't spend a whole lot of time in the astral plane, but it's basically a mini level where you unlock your next ability, so that's more or less what's to be expected, I think. There is a part late in the game where the astral plane is infecting the Bureau, and so you spend more time there, but that also means you're not unlocking abilities anymore. It's just more of a regular level, just with the astral plane theming. It would also seem that there are several astral planes you can miss. I say this because oftentimes you end up in the astral plane when you mess around with these things called objects of power. For almost the entire game, the main quest line naturally brought me to these objects and gave me abilities that I guess would be considered necessary for progression because you have to do them in order to get to the next objective. But there was one time I ran into this random training room, and at the end of it was a safe that gave me some sort of shield ability I never remembered to use. I never came across any other abilities that stuck out to me as ones that are not required for progression, but I thought it was cool that these things were supposedly out there because if I can find one, there's probably more, and that exploring could result in me getting cool abilities to play around with. There were other incentives to explore though, and these were given through mission prompts. Unlike other games where side quests are dished out by talking to some NPC, Control decides to throw quests at you seemingly randomly. Some orange text will appear on the screen and you can choose to activate it, making that side quest the new objective you're tracking. I did one of these on accident because I thought it was a main quest line, and after I finished it, I was puzzled because it felt out of place with the rest of the game. It wasn't so terribly different that it felt like a waste of my time, but when I finished it, I had this feeling of something isn't quite right. As far as I'm aware, I didn't even get a reward for this experience either. Maybe it gave me some materials to upgrade my gear, which I'll talk about later, but I honestly have no idea. So the side quest may very well have been pointless filler, which is bad enough, but it gets worse because the prompts for these quests would always appear while I was in the middle of heated battles or important story beats. Even if I could have gotten a good reward from them, I rarely was given the prompt while walking down an empty hallway from point A to point B when I would have been most likely to take them. Instead, it was while I was in the thick of it and didn't want to leave, and if anything, it broke immersion or distracted from what was happening. I think this game would have benefited greatly from just removing these side quests entirely. Maybe they serve some greater function I don't know about since I did almost none of them, but I don't think it was implemented very well. Since I just mentioned it a little bit ago, let's talk really quickly about upgrades in this game. They are all referred to as mods and then are either personal mods that affect your character or gun mods which affect your gun. You are also given points after completing certain milestones in the game, and these allow you to purchase upgrades or even new abilities from the available skill tree. At first, I thought you had to be at one of the game's waypoints in order to upgrade anything, and you do for certain upgrades, and that being your abilities and adding mod slots for your guns. But after several hours, I was getting a bit confused since I kept on picking up these mods on the ground but could never figure out where they were going. There is actually a prompt that appears at the bottom right side of the screen that tells you how to access these upgrades, but I never actually saw this prompt until several hours into the game, at which point I felt like an idiot because this menu opens a number of possibilities. It allows me to put mods on the guns I have, thereby allowing me to upgrade their power one way or another, but it also gave me access to more of the gun variants I had previously unlocked but had no idea how to use. One of them was even called Pierce, and when I first got it, I thought it meant that the two guns I had been using now pierced, but now I learned it was actually a different gun variant entirely. I only ever used 4 of the variants I had and only ever unlocked 5. There might be more for all I know, but I was happy with the ones I got, and we'll talk more about them very soon when we get to combat. First, I want to quickly share my thoughts on the ability upgrades. Some would enhance your abilities to an extent that you'd basically unlock a new ability altogether, which is super nice, but most of the time, you were just adding a percentage to the amount of energy or health or damage you had or did. It's not the most exciting thing in the world, but it did make a world of difference if you ask me. I learned early on that the ability to grab and throw things was more reliable and more powerful than any of my guns, as well as necessary against certain enemies, so I poured my points into having more energy and used personal mods to increase the damage output of that power, and thus I became a Jedi with a gun. There isn't much to love or hate about these, but I was a bit thrown off that there are 2 different menus for upgrading different things, but this also meant some upgrades could only be done at waypoints while others could be done mid-battle, which was very essential at some points. On to combat, my favorite part of any game, and Control I think does it pretty well. There was never a point I felt things were too easy, nor a time I thought they were too hard. The enemies also scaled alongside me to such an extent that it felt as though I were on the same power level the entire game, which is a little sad since sometimes you want a nice little power trip, but it's fine. It's usually a good thing when they scale with you. You also don't want the game to become too easy, so yeah, it's not really a complaint. It's just sometimes I wished I could just cream everything. Now, there are 3 main attacks: your gun, the Force, as I'll call it, I don't know if it actually has a name in the game, and melee strikes. I almost never used melee attacks, but that's partially because I poured all my upgrades into the energy bar rather than into the melee upgrades, so you could definitely play this game very differently if you decided to do that. After glancing at the abilities, it sure seems like it could have been a lot of fun. There are several different kinds of enemies, but not really a massive enemy variety. There's guys who fly, your typical on-the-ground grunts, and guys who have armor, though the armored ones can either fly or be on the ground. I don't know if any of these enemies have any particular names, so there isn't a whole lot to distinguish them from each other than the weapons they use. There were basically 2 kinds of ground grunts, one that shot regular guns and those that launched rockets. At one point I was able to upgrade my force attack so I could redirect the rockets back at them, which was cool, but overall the explosive guys were often harder to deal with. A sniper variant is also introduced a bit later into the game, but a shaft of light is drawn from the sniper to wherever they're aiming, so it's easy to tell when you're in the line of fire, as well as to track the light back to the guy shooting at you. There's the flying guys, who were always the most annoying. One of the variants goes full kamikaze, and these things, although one of the weakest enemies, was also one of the most terrifying, partially because they were the freakiest to look at, but also because they would explode when you killed them. This could do splash damage to enemies near them, so that was nice sometimes, but it would also create a mist that made it hard to see what was happening near where the explosion was. This meant that if there was a horde of these things, killing one could easily make it hard to tell where the others were until they were right on top of you. I hate these guys, but in a good way, I guess. There's also ones that float around and pretty much always dodge my force attacks, so I'm relegated to shooting them with a gun. They aren't really a problem unless you leave them alone and aren't paying any attention to them. Whenever I did that, I almost always got hit with one of their ranged attacks seemingly out of nowhere because I wasn't watching them shoot at me. Dealing with a group of these guys can be quite difficult. There's also bosses, I guess, but I'm using the term quite loosely. Sometimes there'd be a big guy with a lot of health you'd have to fight like they were a boss, but then there were other similar circumstances where there was actually a big health bar. Often the ones with the big health bar would become normal enemies afterwards, and ones that didn't have the health bar were usually more tanky versions of enemies you'd already fought. There isn't much to say about these guys because they weren't particularly different than your typical enemy, which is sad. There was one that turned invisible with only a little mist or something left behind to find it, and once you get close enough, it'll jump scare you and attack. The first time I encountered this thing, it was genuinely terrifying, and even after I knew the trick, they were still quite tough to deal with since the game would start throwing more than one of them at you or else throw other enemies into the mix, and that made things all the more confusing. It made it really easy to lose track of where this guy is. And finally, let's talk about the gun variants, which maybe I should have mentioned earlier, I don't know. There are 4 variants that I used during my time with this game. There's the standard pistol, a machine gun, a sniper, and a shotgun. There are others, but I didn't use any of them, and while I mentioned this earlier, I got one other and I never understood it, and maybe there's others, but I don't know. I used these 4. You use the same gun thing for all these different variants, so it's not like you're rotating in and out of different weapons. You can also only have 2 gun types equipped at any good time, and you have to alternate between them. Mid-battles, you can enter the menu and switch which ones you're using, which becomes much more important later in the game, but you can get away with the standard pistol for most of the first half at least. I do think the pistol was, bar none, the most useful and effective weapon, but perhaps that's just because it's meant to be the all-around weapon that is effective in every circumstance, even if it's not the most effective. I like the idea of the shotgun and often enjoy shotguns quite a bit in other games, but I found the one in Control to be a bit lackluster. You really did have to be at close to melee range in order for this thing to potentially do more damage than the pistol, but even then it felt pretty hit or miss. Sometimes I'd be inches away, fire, and do next to no damage. It was a bit inconsistent, but did at least stagger enemies most of the time. It could also take out armor, which was something unique to it. Overall, it was a nice idea, but could have used a little more work. The machine gun is fine, but only got good when I attached a mod that increased its damage output, at which point it could melt enemies at close to mid-range. This weapon sucked against anything farther away than a few yards, but in its elements, it really shined. I stuck to this one and the pistol for most of the run, though that was partially because I didn't know how to switch to them for quite a while. I actually even stopped using it as I went along, though I'm not sure why. In hindsight, I kept on using the shotgun when the machine gun really is just better in nearly every way. I guess I just usually love shotguns, so I just kept using it, expecting it to suddenly perform better. And finally, there's the sniper variant, which was super helpful with picking off an enemy or two from afar, or else dealing with some of the floating enemies or snipers. It actually felt like a pretty weak weapon though for a sniper. It did the damage of maybe 3 shots from the pistol, and although the sniper isn't too slow in its attack speed, the problem is that you only get 2 shots with it before you have to reload. See, in Control, you have a set amount of ammo, and if you stop shooting for a couple seconds, then it'll recharge. But if you use all your weapon ammo, then you are stuck. It recharges automatically, but it always felt as though if you went through all your rounds, then it would take longer than if you didn't use all of them. But when you only got 2 shots and 1 shot was almost never enough, this weapon could really easily put me in a pickle. I wish it had 1 more ammo slot. That's basically what I'm trying to say. And that's basically all the mechanics. So let's talk about the end of the game, or at least talk about the end as best as I can make sense of it. There's a sequence of enemies you have to fight until you free this weird structure thing where I think the entity that lives inside you that gives you your power is being held. You're then shown some cutscenes where Jesse gets all red and glowy and evil looking, and then the credits roll. It was a really weird way to end the game, and yeah, that's not the end of the game, was it? So now I'm your average office worker, and it actually gives me a main quest line that includes delivering mail, picking up coffee mugs, and pressing a button on a copying machine. I was a bit confused at first, but eventually I was told to deliver some mail to the director. I did this and was brought back to the same place. So instead of doing the chores again, I went right to where the mail was last time. Sure enough, it was there. So it would seem the game is just trying to troll you into doing chores and You don't have to do it, and I can appreciate that. When that's over with, I'm pretty sure you use a projector that's actually a gate into another dimension to go into this really red place to shoot a bunch of bad guys, use the force on your brother's head, and then credits roll once again. Well, still a weird ending, but I guess I feel like things have been wrapped up pretty good. I've always gotten into the habit of watching all the credits because these people worked hard to make this game, so darn it, I'm going to at least let them roll and show them the smallest amount of appreciation. Only thing is, at the end of these credits, I discover I have now fully accepted the role as director, which I have been resisting this entire time, and the game isn't actually over. This is the point the astral plane is infesting the Bureau, and if it gets loose, it'll probably destroy the world or some such nonsense. This part of the game took maybe a quarter or more of my total playtime, and it's also the most confusing part. Most of it revolved around this thing called the nail, and to finally destroy or cleanse it or something, you have to do the biggest and coolest boss fight yet. But once that's over, Jessie talks about wanting to do things her way, and you're brought back to the area's hub with no more quests. I wandered around and tried to figure out if maybe I needed to go somewhere to activate the next quest, but found nothing. I googled what the ending of this game even was to see if there really was more game to play, but then all the articles were talking about the last credit roll as the ending of the game. So was what I just did some sort of extra? Did I reach the actual end points? I have no idea. The last credit roll and the boss I just beat both feel pretty conclusive, but I'm also unsure I stopped the spread of the astral plane, so I haven't the foggiest. Maybe there's more game, maybe there's not, but I decided to call it there. So, how good was Control? Well, I'd probably give it a solid 7 out of 10. It definitely was quite fun, and if you're the kind of person who likes Christopher Nolan films or just really mysterious, cryptic stories, then this is definitely the kind of game for you. But even if you just like shooting things and don't care about story like me, this is still a good option. So check it out if you like what you see, and let me know if there's more game to this one, because I'm not sure I ever reached the actual ending.